Okay, so in this video, we're actually going to take our pages that we've created and actually do something with them. And except this time, we're not going to use page2 or page-2.js. We're going to use a new page, which I'm going to do a new file and a new page. And this is simply just going to be page.js. I mean, that is kind of a ridiculous name, but that's what we're naming this thing specifically because, well, this kind of page is going to be able to pull in information about pages, right? Not posts or anything like that, pages. So we're going to call it page.js, and we're going to start by importing, actually, let's just do RCC, a new React component with my snippet library, or I recommend getting a snippet library. Doesn't matter which one, any one that will create a new component is good for you. So let's go ahead and give this component as much of a name as we need to, which is just going to be page extends page. And now at this point, we have our React component page, right? And we want to run a query on this page. Let's actually just throw a hi in here and say hello. Okay, just so we know that this page is being used. And we're going to want to have a query in here. So let's first head to this Gatsby node file and tell this to use page.js rather than page-2. And let's head back to our page.js and let's write our query. Let's do export const query. And again, this is very much a Gatsby thing. I keep saying this, but this is a Gatsby specific way of doing things right here, having a export const query being the query for the page itself. This kind of thing isn't going to hold up in other systems, so don't try to take this into other GraphQL systems. What we're going to be doing is simply just exporting a new constant variable named query, and this query has to be named query, and then we're going to give this a name. Now you could give this a name like I'm going to just have this be called page query and open up a set of brackets. Now at this point, I'm going to once again head to my graphical editor, and I'm going to go ahead and grab all of the stuff inside of here, and I'm just going to output all WordPress pages. We're going to want to make sure we can get a single query working in this before we try to make this more complex, okay? We're just going to want to make sure the query is working before we add any additional bells and whistles. Now I understand that this is the query for all of the pages, and it won't be momentarily. So we now simply just have a component and we have a query. And this query is going to grab all of the pages. In our Gatsby site, we should be able to, you'd think we'd be able to refresh this and have this work, but no, we have to stop and restart our server because there's been changes made to our node server file. And what we do is get rid of this and watch this thing refire up, okay? And after that, we should be able to head into our React dev tools and see some interesting information. We should be able to see the data that we were waiting for actually available. I'm going to click inspect in here just to get this ready while this is getting all ready itself. Okay, so step one that's really cool is that we now have our hello output here, which means it's using the correct file. If I go to inspect this, and I meant to do that in my React dev tools. If I head to React dev tools and we check out this individual page, we into route, component route, and page. Now, this is really great. If we head into the data prop, we should be able to see an object, all WordPress page. And we see that, and we should have both of our nodes, and inside of our nodes, the page information. This is great. This means that we are now officially hitting the WordPress API, and if we really wanted to, we could output the data from this query using just props.data. But again, since this is the wrong data, this is a list of all of the pages, we want to get a specific page, and that specific page defined by the slug here, we're going to have a new query. So let's go ahead and build that query first in our graphical, because that's the best way to do it in my opinion. We can get rid of this current all WordPress one, and we can just say WordPress page. Now WordPress page is going to need an argument. So we're going to once again do a slug colon and then an object eq colon and then whatever, we need double quotes in here, not single quotes, whatever of course the slug may be. In this case, it's sample page. So let's just drop sample page in here. And let's go ahead and simply say, hey, I want the title. Just give me the title. Let's run this one. Let me get rid of these other queries to get rid of some of this noise. Run this query and we can see we have been output the sample page title. Brilliant. So we know this query is working. What other things might we want from this post other than the title? Well, you might think we want something like a body. Well, okay, I don't see a body in here. It would autocomplete if it existed, but we will want the slug. Let's go ahead and actually hold the Option key and select WordPress, and we should have our options over here again. Now let's go ahead and see what's available when I select WordPress page under type if we don't have something called a body. If we scroll down here, you can see there is something called the content, which makes sense. We also have access to the excerpt if we wanted to use that in some sort of blog listing at some point, right? Because that makes a lot of sense too. So we could say content and hit go. We now have the blog content in HTML, we now have our sample page, and we now have our title. So let's go ahead and use this query to build this page. I'm going to click this, copy this, and let's head back to our content and paste this query in here. Now, what we should be getting is the sample page query will be working. So at this point, we could come up top here and we could do const data is equal to this dot props. From here, we could change our h1 from being data to being data dot, and then again, we'll want to grab it in the exact same sort of object that we passed in, which was WordPress page dot and then title. Let's go ahead and save this and check this out. We should actually have this query pulling in the correct data now into our WordPress page if we give this, and you don't even have to give it a refresh. A hot reload works. We have a sample page. And this is brilliant because when we generate a static site, this is going to be statically generated. Again, it's going to load so quickly if this is just static HTML. Okay, so that's great. We have some movement here, but you might have had some concern with how we were doing this. For instance, if we were to once again run our all post queries here, all page query, not post. If we were to run our all WordPress page and access the edges node and then the slug, you would see that we have another slug, which if we scroll down here is going to be welcome. Now, if we head to the welcome page, you're going to see something a little distressing. Obviously, because we're using one query that is not dynamically accepting a slug, we're returning the same exact data even though we're asking for a different page. So that's not going to work. Let's go ahead and revisit our query. And you might already sort of know what's going on, especially if you did the Gatsby course. You might be saying, hey, we hard-coded this sample page slug into our query. Well, how do we get something that's not hard-coded in here? Well, I'm glad you asked, because what we can do is actually define a property coming into the query by having parentheses after the name page query. And we're going to define it as $slug. $slug is going to be a string with an exclamation point. Exclamation point means it's required, as in we can't run this query without a string. If we try to do it, it's going to fail. As in if we try to run this right now, if we save this, it's going to be mad because this query is not getting the properties that we're asking for, okay? So now what we want to do is replace this hard-coded sample page string with a slug. And so what's happening is a value is going to come into the page query. It's going to be listed as a slug, and then we're going to use slug as the equal value for the query of slug, for the argument as slug. Okay, so this all works great except for it's not going to work, because this query is not getting anything passed into it yet. So how do we pass something into a GraphQL query? Well, typically you would just do it in the query language as a variable, but since we don't have access to that in Gatsby, we need to do something in our node.js page. So let's head to Gatsby-node, and let's add one more property to this create page. The property we're going to be adding is a context property. Now, context is where we can define variables that get passed into our queries. And in this case, it's going to be an object, right? Context should always be an object where we can define individual properties such as slug. And now slug is going to be the node.slug. So check it out. Let's save this. The node.slug is coming in from our original query. We're getting that. We're setting it to be our context. What's going to happen now, and then we're going to be able to pass that in to our actual query. So if that all went correctly, we should now have a fully dynamic blog page. Well, it might not go correctly right now. What we need to do is we need to stop and then restart our server here. Again, we made changes to our node file, and we need to let the system know that. Okay, this is rebuilt, and you can see our page is already loaded with congratulations, which is, I guess, a fitting heading for this thing because it worked. So congratulations was simply just the title of this post, and if we go back to our sample page post, we also get a sample page. Now let's go ahead and output our body text. If you have done this before, you may have seen some of the pitfalls coming if we were to do something like a P or a paragraph tag here and throw in our data.wordpress page. I believe it was content. If we were to have our data.wordpresspage.content in here, it's going to output the HTML and all sorts of garbage because we need to actually render this HTML, not output it as a string. So what we want to do here instead of that is use a div. And this is going to actually be a self-closing div. So even though Emmett liked to create a div for me there, we're going to have a self-closing div with a property that is dangerously set inner HTML, which sounds dangerous, but it's not that dangerous when we're dealing with what we're doing here. We're going to copy this variable out of here from this line here, and we're going to set the __ HTML prop or property of this object, it's not a prop specifically, to the data.wordpresspage.content. Boom. Just like that, we should now be able to have our HTML. And just like that, we now have a blog page. And keep in mind, this is a page, this isn't a post. There's not a ton of information here, but you have access and knowledge on how to do all of that now. Because if you wanted to get all of your posts up and running in here, just like you have all of your pages, you have to do the exact same thing we did here. And you would simply just add it on into here. And in the next video, we're going to be doing just that, just to show you how easy it is now that you have this process done. What we won't be doing is writing the full-on post page template just like we did here, because after you have it in the system creating pages and all that stuff, the process of hooking it up is going to be the exact same and it would just be a little redundant. But in the next video, what we're going to do is add onto this GraphQL query that runs and creates all of our pages by creating a page for every single post in this site. Then we're going to again create pages. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about what you do to deploy stuff like this and how it differs from normal WordPress. And then you should be ready to go start exploring headless WordPress. This is a really open, evolving space right now, and there's a ton of work still being done. So if you can get a statically generated WordPress site or a server-side rendered WordPress site using React, you are way ahead of the curve. So as always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.